Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Lauren Izo. And coming up in this edition, Israel's parliament hopes to quell protests with new COVID-19 restrictions, but now demonstrators are as angry as ever. And as Jerusalem and Washington ties are as strong as they've ever been, the U.S. gets a special delivery that will reinforce its troops on the ground. Then, an Israeli and an Emirati singer have teamed up to show you how to sing about peace in 3 languages. Well, Israel is a little more than halfway through what Israelis had hoped would be a 3-week nationwide lockdown. Now, the Prime Minister is saying it could last even a month longer, adding that it could take up to a year to completely come out of.
אני רוצה להגדיר את השלבים. אנחנו כרגע בסגר, 3 שלבים. סגר על הדרגות השונות שלו, שגרה עם בדיקות מהירות וחיסון. ואנחנו רוצים להגדיר את המעברים, איך אנחנו מגדירים מבחינה כמותית מעבר מכאן לשם.
Cases continue to spike despite the measures in place until now. Since Wednesday, the health ministry reporting 8,919 new cases, with more than 200 on ventilators. Israeli hospitals are over capacity, and doctors on the front lines are desperate for concrete solutions. After a grueling hours-long meeting on Wednesday, Israel's COVID cabinet decided to buckle down and tighten those restrictions and increase resources.
הכנת מערכת הבריאות גם לחורף, גם לעליית התחלואה. אנחנו עוברים מ-700 ל-1,500 מיטות לחולים קשים. הדבר השני שאנחנו עושים זה הסברת מסכות מסיבית. אנחנו מתחילים עם סרטונים בנושא הזה, אתם תראו אותם.
Meanwhile, Israel's parliament voted to limit protests in the country, which have been ongoing for months over Netanyahu's corruption charges and the government's handling of the coronavirus crisis. The new legislation outlawing protesters from going further than 1 kilometer from their homes. While officials claim this is crucial for flattening the curve, many lashed out, calling the move undemocratic. Demonstrators argue that this is a ploy to curb the protests, which have been growing in numbers and aggression each week. Netanyahu says there is absolutely no political motive other than stopping the virus. Protesters still came out Wednesday, despite the ruling. And the Jewish high holidays are not over just yet. Tomorrow is the eve of Sukkot. The ultra-Orthodox sector of Israel have fought against holiday restrictions, and according to a top health official, 1/3 of Israel's coronavirus cases are in the ultra-Orthodox community. The Corona cabinet has also tightened restrictions on praying and gathering in synagogues, so religious leaders had to be a little bit creative this year. ILTV's Hannah Rifkin takes a look at what the holiday of Sukkot means and how to keep our distance while commemorating it.
There are several aspects to explaining what exactly the Sukkot holiday is and what it represents. And while we won't be hosting large feasts in our temporary dwellings this year, Jews around the world are still building their sukkahs, or huts in English, and buying their 4 species. The concept of the sukkah, or the hut, is about bringing warmth and comfort from indoors to the outdoors. The sukkah itself, with its walls surrounding us, symbolizes God's protection and his embrace. And according to Rabbi Goldberg from Chabad of Rehavia in Jerusalem, during the pandemic specifically, we find that even though those in quarantine shouldn't be leaving their homes, this is God's way of protecting us. While each of the species have their own characteristics, thus symbolizing different kinds of Jews, the 3rd species, also known as the arava, or the willow branch, has no smell and no taste. This, according to some rabbis, is a reminder to pray for those sick to recover from the virus and to keep in mind those lost. And though Chabad, just like every year, will be bringing their famous sukkah-mobiles around our Jewish communities, this year the small portable sukkah holds special significance.
So as you guys can see, Sukkot come in all different shapes and sizes. This is actually one of the smaller Sukkot that I've seen. But as Rabbi Goldberg showed us before, it's really easy to fit 1 or 2 people into the sukkah. And especially because of COVID-19, this is going to be a way for people to be able to, spend time in a sukkah. Of course, I want to add, it's really important that anybody who is celebrating the holiday of Sukkot adheres to the important health guidelines, make sure to be with their immediate family, make sure to social distance, because we want to make sure that we could keep the holiday as safely as possible.
From ILTV, wishing you a safe and happy Sukkot.
Daniel Pomerantz is the CEO of HonestReporting.com, a media monitoring NGO based in Jerusalem, and he joins us now. Thank you, sir, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as we just said, Sukkot begins tomorrow. Obviously, there is some anticipation to see if the ultra-Orthodox community will abide by the restrictions over the holiday. We've seen from previous holidays that even with the lockdown, the community, held some mass gatherings, and now the health ministry is saying that 1/3 of our COVID-19 cases are coming from the ultra-Orthodox sector. Now, do the members of this community believe celebrating is more important than the restrictions, or will they likely reduce gatherings? I mean, are they afraid of the virus?
Well, in Orthodox communities tend to respond most of all to the direction of the local community rabbi, not to a single central source of information. And so there's a variation in what different communities believe, but there are certainly some ultra-religious communities that either don't take the virus very seriously or simply believe that religious observance is more important, just as there are secular communities that believe that political protest is more important, either because they underestimate the virus or put a higher importance on the other activity.
Absolutely, and I do want to get to those protests in just one second, but a large part of this holiday is gathering with your entire family in what is called a sukkah, this little makeshift house that people build in their backyards to eat in and sleep in and do all kinds of things in during this holiday. So obviously that gathering is a really important part of this specific holiday. Will they still have Sukkot in their backyards, and will they still invite people over to celebrate together?
It appears that people will. There's ways to do it within the guidelines, but as we've seen, people often violate the guidelines. Sometimes our political leaders violate the guidelines. Israel is a country that places a great deal of value on personal independence and on arguing. And it's a vibrant democracy, and vibrant democracies are not ideally suited to handle virus outbreaks. And so it's going to be a challenge, whether because the guidelines aren't good enough or because they aren't well enforced enough, or simply because people just aren't taking them seriously enough and are placing personal individuality over the safety of our society as a whole.
Sure, and as a vibrant democracy, protesting is a big part of that, as we just touched on a second ago. So now that these protests have been, severely limited, what kind of an impact does that have on Israel's democracy as a whole? Is this, something that can help Netanyahu politically, or it's not about that at all?
I don't believe this will have a significant impact on Netanyahu politically. His criminal charges have been known for a long time. They haven't. Those criminal charges have not had a significant effect on his popularity ratings or that of his coalition throughout the past couple years, nor throughout the past 3 elections. However, in Israel, even more so than in other democracies, protest is a significant way of expressing political will and creating change. And it does create a certain danger in that protests are dangerous because they can spread the virus. But on the other hand, a lack of protest is dangerous because if the COVID-related restrictions were in some way politically incorrect, politically unviable, that they actually violated people's rights in a way that didn't help keep people safe, without protests, we would lose our most important tool for communicating that to our elected leaders.
I want to speak about the lockdown in general. Until now, it seemed that, other than some small businesses being banned from opening, largely, life has continued as usual. And because of this, these small business owners feel singled out, and therefore they want to rebel against, what's going on. They want to rebel against the authorities. Is there a way to create a lockdown, implement restrictions, flatten the curve, while still pleasing everyone politically?
Well, it's not possible to please everybody. And this is one of the challenges in a democracy, that a democracy demands that decisions be made by compromise and by consensus. But in the case of a virus, it's simply a fact. The virus spreads more inside than outside. So going to the beach is not nearly as dangerous as praying in a synagogue, or for that matter, eating a meal in a restaurant. And it's not fair and it's not right. But it's not what our government chooses for us. It's what the virus chooses for us. And we have to start listening to the virus and do what makes sense based on what our health officials are telling us. And at the same time, sometimes it's not going to be fair, but we also have to make sure that we do it in a way that makes sense. If we allow large gatherings, for example, for religious purposes or for protests that do spread the virus, and then limit other things that don't really spread the virus as much, people will simply say, look, this doesn't make sense. It's not keeping anyone safe. Why should I suffer for it?
Right. Well, Daniel Pomerantz, we will obviously have to find a solution together as a country. Thank you so much, and happy Sukkot. Have a happy and healthy holiday.
Thank you, likewise.
Well, in the background of COVID-19, Israel-U.S. relations are as strong as ever, including sharing military equipment. Israel delivered the first of 2 Iron Dome missile defense system batteries to the United States Army. Since signing a deal a year ago with the Haifa-based weapons manufacturer Rafael Systems, Israel's Ministry of Defense confirming that they will be used by U.S. troops against ballistic and aerial threats. In March, the U.S. canceled plans to purchase more of the batteries because of the difficulties integrating them into the existing air defense systems. Congress has given Israel more than $1.5 billion to produce Iron Dome batteries. Well, in other military news, Azerbaijan has reportedly been using Israeli weapons in their latest clash with Armenia. An assistant to the Azeri president confirming the use of Israeli drones to Walla News on Wednesday. While he affirmed the use of the drones, he added he doesn't expect Israel to vocally support the Azeris in the conflict, but that there are many agreements behind the scenes. Now ongoing for almost a week, the heavy fighting that broke out over the separatist region of Nagorno-Karabakh is the biggest escalation in years, and dozens have been killed. Well, hello, shalom, salam. For the first time since the historic normalization deal between Israel and the UAE, an Israeli and an Emirati have teamed up to make music. The song, called Hello Friend, features Israel's Elkana Marziano and the UAE's Walid Al-Jassim. Marziano is the winner of the 3rd season of the Israeli version of The Voice, and Al-Jassim is a household name in the UAE. The song, written by Israeli Doron Medali and Henry, features Hebrew, Arabic, and English, and seeks to convey a message of peace between the two countries.
يا سلام يا بابا يا سلام يا ماما يا سلام يا سلام كل ولاد العالم يا سلام يا أبا يا سلام يا إيمة يا سلام كل يلدينا You hear me friend far away You hear my prayer I hear you friend far away I hear you pray.
Wow, that is really catchy. The dynamic is obviously changing in the Middle East. First, the United Arab Emirates, then Bahrain. And according to some world leaders, including U.S. President Donald Trump, there might be more. But taking a deeper look into the media and public reaction might paint a little bit of a different picture. So let's open our eyes and get a global perspective of what the new Middle East looks like on the ground, at least according to the Arab world. Noam Bannett is a lecturer and analyst on the Middle East and the Arab world, specializing in political cartoons. Thanks, Noam, for joining us.
Hey, thank you for having me.
Okay, so I want to start with the normalization deals. You know, there was a lot of talk that we were going to see a peace deal between Israel and Sudan following those other 2 that I mentioned. So far, that has not happened. These cartoons that you've showed me seem like they're showing some sign of a lifeline for Sudan. Is that true?
The situation in Sudan is very interesting. Sudan is in a very bad situation because, in the one hand, they want the international community to change their approach. Of course, especially Israel, especially the United States. But they're also divided between themselves. So there's a part of them that want, of course, the normalization with Israel to get out of the list of countries that support terrorism and get economic, help but some of them still see Israel as a problem. So because they're divided, we can hear voices from this side and this side.
Really interesting. Many see these deals as a sort of affront against Iran. So how are we seeing that illustrated in the cartoons from this week from the Arab world?
So we have a very interesting cartoon from Carlos Latouf. He's a very known BDS activist. We see how the whole story that we hear about the normalization is to isolate Iran. I have to mention that most of the cartoons that I see, they're talking about the countries themselves. They're criticizing Bahrain and the Emirates of abandoning the Palestinians, or cartoons from Emirates or Bahrain talking against the countries that are criticizing them. For example, cartoon against Turkey or against Qatar that are usually criticizing and they're against the normalization.
I just want to talk specifically about the cartoon we were just looking at. It shows a leader from the UAE, from Bahrain, and from Israel riding on a rocket that's headed towards Iran. If you could just explain the significance of what's going on here.
First of all, we can see, of course, Uncle Sam as the United States with a big missile to Iran. We see an Israeli and two Arabs, and we see that they ride from Bahrain and from UAE, that we can see how this is a big deal from the United States, reminds us who is in charge of the deal. Many in Israel, and some of them are right, of course, mentioning Netanyahu as the one who is really moving this deal. But of course, this cartoon mentioned in a bad way Uncle Sam. And as we see, the destination of the missile is to Iran.
All right, there's, obviously another side that we have to touch on, which is the reaction coming from the Palestinians. This week was the anniversary of the second Intifada, and of course there's many cartoons regarding that Intifada. But one that really stood out to me this week was one of a Christian, a Muslim, and a Jew praying together. And it seems like coronavirus walks into the room to sort of disrupt their prayer, or I'm not sure what's really going on here. So why don't you explain for us, what is the situation in this cartoon?
Okay, so the last cartoon that we saw is a cartoon that came from Gaza. It, of course, refers to how we all put aside the religious wars in favor for prayer. And the reason is, of course, the coronavirus. We see the three fight in the upper part of it, and the lower part, we see how everybody is praying for their God to help them from the coronavirus. You spoke about the 20 years of the Intifada and how the Palestinians see the situation. You know that yesterday marked 20 years since the blood libel of the boy called Muhammad Adora. There's a very famous incident where we see him and his father. And it took the state of Israel a long time to prove that the IDF wasn't in charge, or they didn't kill the child. And, it's very interesting how we see in the cartoons and also off the cartoons and the diplomacy path, where were the Palestinians in October 20,
right,
in the beginning of the Intifada al-Aqsa, and where are they now feeling so abandoned from their brothers from the Arab world.
Right, obviously a lot to take away from these cartoons. And just going back to that COVID-19 cartoon that we took a look at, although, it's sending all of us into isolation, obviously somehow it's bringing people in the world together. So Noam Bannett, thank you as always for all your insight.
Thank you very much.
One story this week has been sending shockwaves throughout the country. This is a photo of Aviad Moshe. He is the man who repeatedly beat and stabbed his wife Shira as she held on to their 2-year-old child, and while she spoke to her parents on Zoom. Her parents witnessed the entire ordeal that nearly killed her, begging her husband to stop remotely. The attack taking place over Rosh Hashanah on September 18th. Now, last week, the Beersheva Magistrates Court ruled that the suspect could remain anonymous and have his identity hidden in the media. Lawyers representing Shira expressed her outrage with the decision, and many women's rights groups and even politicians shared his name and photo in response. Meretz party MK Merav Michaeli tweeted, "Make note of this. Aviad Moshe is the man accused in the attempted murder of his wife Shira. A reputation like that deserves many years in prison. The gag order has since been overturned, and Shira has personally asked that her photo and his identity be shared on social media. A crowdfunding page has been set up to raise 320,000 shekels to restore Shira's smile by paying for reconstruction surgery. It has already raised over 1 million shekels in donations from 9,000 people. What a tragic story. Now, from one brave woman to another. A piece of Jewish feminist history will be donated to a Tel Aviv museum for an exhibition opening in December. Ruth Bader Ginsburg, the late Supreme Court Justice who passed away just 2 weeks ago, had agreed before her death to donate one of her famous lace collars and a signed copy of her autobiography to the Museum of Jewish People in Tel Aviv. In addition to the new exhibit, RBG is also a part of their display called Heroes Trailblazers of the Jewish People, which features profiles and accomplishments of Jewish historical and contemporary figures, including scientists, philosophers, cultural icons, inventors, and athletes. One Israeli company is changing the way we cheer on our favorite sports teams. As the biggest leagues in the world play in secluded bubbles amid the pandemic, this company called Minute has partnered with the European Basketball Champions League for its Final 8, taking place this week in Athens until October 4th. Fans will be able to firstly record themselves cheering for their favorite teams, which will be shown on a digital screen at the game, and they'll also be able to see popular highlight replays in real time from home. James Spiro is a journalist at CTEC by Calcalist. He covered this story. James, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.
Now, first of all, how has COVID-19 transformed the sports industry? Obviously, a massive part of the games is having a crowd and feeding off of their energy. Is it really the same experience as before?
Yeah, thank you. So it's not the same experience as before, but COVID has caused no experience to be the same. So sports is not immune to that. And it's a bit of a problem because a lot of the fans don't get to see their favorite teams play. But, you know, on the flip side of that coin, a lot of the players don't get to interact with their fans and feed off their energy. So a lot of stadiums are empty and a lot of fields are deserted, but that's the games that are even allowed to play. So at the moment, things seem to be opening up a bit more in other parts of the world, but a lot of things have just been shut down, and it's causing a real problem for the industry, but also for the atmosphere and the fans.
So tell me about this specific technology that you've looked into by Minute. Now, it involves helping the viewer cheer for their team and also watching highlights. How does it work exactly? And is there anything similar out there?
Right. So what happened was the Basketball Champions League, which is currently taking place for the Final 8 in Athens in Greece, is occurring this week. And they partnered with a company called CrowdAmp. So what CrowdAmp does is they facilitate the recording and the distribution of the kind of fans that are cheering. And what Minute does is Minute scans these clips. So it takes the player's performance and it takes the crowd reaction, and it uses artificial intelligence to track their behavior. So we can see the positive performance from the players, and we can see the positive reaction from the crowds. And what it does is it uses artificial intelligence to pinpoint those moments and create an 8 to 10 second instant replay video. So think of it like YouTube. When you scroll your mouse over the video you want to play, a few clips come up for a few seconds. So whereas that was once randomized and automized, what Minute does is it takes the best moments to try and get people to click and watch that clip. So for the fans that are cheering along at home, they can use one technology, but what Minute does is it gets people clicking on that clip to begin with. And that's a huge benefit, not only for the fans who will get to watch the film, watch the broadcasts, but also for the broadcasters and the publications that need those users to click. So it's great for engagement, and it's generally good for sporting the atmosphere all round.
Fascinating stuff. James Spiro, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now it's time to take a look at the weather forecast. Lows tonight will be at around 74 Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. As the holiday of Sukkot begins this weekend, temperatures start to cool down just a bit, holding all weekend long at highs of 90 Fahrenheit or 32 degrees Celsius. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.42 shekels to the American dollar and 2.57 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube and Roku TV pages. I'm Lauren Izzo. Thanks so much for watching.